Thank you. And thank you to the History Center for having me here today. I haven't spoken here for several years. Vicki and I thought maybe 8 or 9 years, but I'm very happy to be back. I am a native of Robizonia, so it's very important to me to do programs in Berks County. My father was born on Penn Avenue, right there in Robizonia. I graduated from Conrad Weiser, so it's always a really special thing to speak at the History Center. My topic today is one I sort of came across by accident, and mostly because of my interest in one of the women that I'm going to be talking about today, Catherine Milhouse. We'll get to her toward the end of the program, but that's how this started. And then I began to realize that there were many women writing about the Pennsylvania Germans in the 20th century, and a lot of fiction being written about Pennsylvania Germans since the very beginning of the 20th century by women, which I thought was very intriguing. So it made me want to look further into this topic to find out more about these women and where they came from and who they were. So I will just start off with this. When we're talking about these books that these women wrote, they tend to have a group of very similar topics. As you can see up on the screen, tradition versus progress is a common theme. Unworldly versus worldliness. This is particularly true of the writers that wrote about the Amish or Mennonites, which were most of them, because they found those groups most intriguing and quaint. They were the ones that they were the groups that really attracted the interest of many of these writers. An intractable patriarch, we find him in almost every story. There is a father that is stubborn, that is stuck in the old ways and difficult in many ways. Superstition, or what we often call folk belief, which usually manifests itself in that wonderful practice of powwow. The fish out of water, often a non-Pennsylvania German person introduced into the story who is expressing some sort of new ideas that do not jive with usually the intractable patriarch. Ignorance versus education, that's a difficult one for me because I always feel that the idea of the Pennsylvania Germans being an uneducated people was very unfair and very, very wrong. An idea we should not be holding at all. I grew up with hearing that phrase, the dumb Dutch. Well, that is not true. I know the group of people that I work for were among some of the most literate settlers in Pennsylvania, the Schwenkfelders. They were highly literate people, and the people were very devoted to education, both in the home and in schools. Quaintness, as I mentioned that before, that is a major factor in many of these stories. The quaint behaviors and practices of the Pennsylvania Germans, and especially after the 1920s, after a little event that was the York Hex murders. I always point to that. Is anybody familiar with the York Hex murders? They occurred in 1928, and they put Pennsylvania Dutch on the national map because of the news, the media attention to the York Hex murders. I'll have you look that up later, or I will be gladly to expound on that at the end of the program. But it really shone a spotlight on the Pennsylvania Germans after 1928, and particularly on their folk traditions and superstitious nature that they were said to have. And of course, then we have the romance with someone not from the culture. This was very common theme, and also went with that fish out of water theme. So the first author I'm going to talk about is Helen Ryman Snyder Martin. Now, she has a very Germanic middle name, but she was not Pennsylvania German. And she was really the first author in the 20th century who was writing about the Pennsylvania Germans. She was the daughter of a German immigrant and a Lutheran minister. And the family was living in Lancaster, which is where she had the influence of wanting to write about the Pennsylvania Germans and using them as the main characters in her novels. And specifically then, in her case, Mennonites and Amish girls. So her most well-known novel was Tilly, a Mennonite Maid. Has anybody heard of this book? It's a very ancient book. Yes, good. There's a few nodding. 1904. So what? It's 120 years old now. She was very prolific, writing many novels and short stories during her time. And this work in particular was very popular, very much promoted, and then later was made into a play. Let me go back. That one's a play, and I believe also a silent movie, believe it or not. And this involved the intractable patriarch and sort of the forbidden romance and the girl that wanted to become educated, and because her father did not want her to become educated, it was that clash between the father and daughter, and that kind of typical thing. This, I just wanted to show you this image. This is from a story called The Betrothal of Eliphalet by Helen Martin. And this little drawing from the book, it says, she'd been to Millersville Normal and it got her that proud. And Jake's mom wants to say Jake didn't do just so well. So it's an example of, once again, a young woman in this story who wanted to become educated and go to college, but did not, or could not. Sabina, or Sabina, depending on how you say it. I actually have a friend named Sabina, so I always pronounce it Sabina, was what we'd call the first ever bonnet fiction. And bonnet fiction continues today. And you can buy these books everywhere, probably especially in Lancaster County, these romances that involve Amish characters. And this would have been really the first one of that sort. And I actually have some passages from this book. During the program, I'd like to read to you a little bit from these books. We'll see if my bad Pennsylvania Dutch accent comes into play, but okay. So this is from Sabina. Without another word, Levi stumbled out of the kitchen and disappeared into the stable. The mother, looking anxious and distressed, returned to Sammy and Melinda, and Aunt Susanna nervously resumed her knitting. Sabina, urged Acker, come outside and tell me what all this means. The girl, still white and now almost apathetic, allowed herself to be led out of doors, and they sat down side by side on the porch steps. In a voice so low he had now and then to bring his ear close to her lips, she told him of the grim vision that came now and then to haunt her, and of the calamity it inevitably foretold. One night, a year back already, when I was off on visiting my Auntie Rebecca over in Cocalico Township, I had a dream of seeing such an ugly face of a man, so wicked-like. When I come awake, I couldn't remember none of my dream, but just that ugly face. And I knowed, as certain as if Christ had told it to me, that somebody at home was in trouble. I was to stay at Auntie Rebecca's a week, and this here was only the third day, but nothing would do me after my dream but to go straight on home. I told Auntie Rebecca about my dream in the face, and she didn't put much credit on it. She said I was hystericky, but nothing she nor anyone said stopped me. I come home. And sure enough, Here, Melinda had fell in the well and was nearly drowned. All that night, while I was dreaming of the face, the doctor and Pop and Mom and Aunt Susanna was working to keep Melinda alive. So this is a story she's actually relating to an outsider about this vision she had and these ideas of the supernatural and superstition entering into this book about Sabina. And this one, Barnabetta, was also made into a theatrical play and silent film called Erstwhile Susan, which you can find out a lot about online. I actually do another program about the theater, which was influenced by the Pennsylvania Germans. And I talk about this extensively, about theater plays that actually made it to Broadway with Pennsylvania German themes, not meaning dialect plays that were done at churches and festivals here in southeastern and central Pennsylvania. But this one was quite well known, and when it was turned into a play, had a very famous actress performing the lead role of actually Susan, not Barnabetta. This story is about an intractable patriarch with a daughter that he's basically treating like a servant or even sort of like a slave. And she's very much oppressed and put down. And he gets a mail order bride, this woman named Susan, who then comes and sweeps in and changes everything. And Barnabetta is freed from her servitude to her horrible father. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about, well, no, before I do that, let me just talk a little bit more about Helen Martin. I'm sorry. Helen Martin was under a great deal of scrutiny because she was not Pennsylvania German and writing about the Pennsylvania Germans. And a lot of people thought that she was very unsympathetic and treated the Pennsylvania Germans like they were dumb Dutchmen, that she was making fun of them. And she just wasn't giving them their due. So here is a little bit of information that she herself told a reporter. You can tell the Pennsylvania Dutchman by his speech, even after he sheds his queer clothes and barbering and takes on the guise of the average American, explained Mrs. Martin. A bellboy in Allentown once disarmed my wrath with, "Was you bellin' for me? I didn't hear it make." Now that we know to be a wonderful Pennsylvania Dutchified English phrase. I knew him then as coming from my people. His father probably would say, cocking his weather eye, "It looks for rain. I'm sure it's going to make something down." Or his mother, pricing at market, would ask, "For what do you sell your chickens at? I want to wonder. I feel for getting that fat one." Your washerwoman, with all the deference in the world, will refer to your husband and hers. "Does your Charlie like his shirt ironed? My Mr. don't." Enter Cashtown, Virginville, or Bird in Hand. These are actual towns. You'll see houses painted flagrant red or yellow or pink, flower gardens gorgeous with color, and there all the display or even trace of love of physical beauty stops. The homes are immaculate but ugly. The parlor is furnished at marriage and shut up for years. Most of the living is in the kitchen. The barn is bigger than the house. Well, that is true. And is more modern than the kitchen. That is because the Pennsylvania Dutchman is parsimonious. We will say thrifty, won't we? With everything but the labor of his women. He'll buy modern plows, an automobile, we would say machine, to take his products to market, modern harness to save his horse. Up-to-dateness in the barn means more money in his pocket, but he won't spend a cent to save his wife or his daughter a bit of work. That is what they are there for, to work for men folks in the kitchen or near it. My grandmother and great aunt certainly wouldn't have agreed with that. They ruled the house. When a young man goes courting, his eyes are not blinded with Cupid's bandage. They are wide open to note how the prospective bride qualifies as a frugal, hardworking housewife. I watched a young man studying 3 girls, his object matrimony. They were sewing, and he made a test of their frugality by the way they tore off their threads. The girl who tore off her thread closest to the stitch appealed to him most. Later, he watched them at pie making with another test in mind. He asked each of them for the waste dough scraps. One of the girls, wanting to make a hit, gave him generously. The girl who had won in the first test scrimped a few crumbs for him and won his hand and heart. Soon after, his foot was seen on the rocker of her chair as they talked, which in Pennsylvania Dutch is Pennsylvania Dutch for "I mean to marry that girl." So anyway, those few paragraphs, I think, really underscore who Helen R. Martin was and how she viewed the Pennsylvania Dutch through this lens of even though she lived in Lancaster, she was still an outsider and still had very strong opinions about them and who they were, which certainly, in my opinion, were only partially true. They were just typical stereotypes that were only partially true. Okay, so now we go on, and when Vicki and I were talking about me doing this program, she introduced me to Catherine Regal. I say Regal. I don't know if it's Rigel. Is it Rigel or Regal? Regal. Okay, good. Because being from Berks County, I say Regal. Catherine Regal Luce, and then Elsie Singmaster, who was from the Lehigh Valley originally. So we'll first talk about Catherine. I'm afraid this is not a very becoming picture of her, but she turned out, I was very glad to know of her because she turned out to be a very intriguing person, very, very intriguing. She wrote initially under the nom de plume of Georg Schock, which I discovered, which was the name of one of her ancestors, which made that even more intriguing, and that the fact that she chose that name, very, very interesting. She was the daughter of a surgeon, so grew up in a professional household, went to Bryn Mawr, and as I said, she borrowed her name from her ancestor. I thought, reading her work, she was interesting. She received a lot of very good notices for her one Pennsylvania German book, excuse me, which is called Hearts Contending, which I'm going to read you some passages from. Let me see what my next slide is. So here we go. So these are the two Pennsylvania German themed novels done 13 years apart, but in between and before that, she was doing a lot of short stories, some of which had Pennsylvania German themes, some of which did not. So I'm going to read a little bit right now from Hearts Contending. And this was really interesting, but she had a style that was different, and even though she was let's see, sort of applauded for her ideas about Pennsylvania Germans and how she depicted them, I feel that her characters, her Pennsylvania German characters, often had used vocabulary that you would not have heard anyone use. The vocabulary obviously came from her, and she was a highly educated person. And I noticed right away in the book, I'm not reading the passage today, but she had some of her characters using words that I didn't even know. I had to look up. And they did not seem to be speaking as I would have said a Pennsylvania German character would have. But that is my opinion. However, I was very interested in the way she starts out this book. Though she was so contented, the afternoon passed slowly for Susanna Heilig. The house was still, nobody walking through the hall, nobody in the parlor, nobody upstairs. They had all gone in different directions, and she looked out and wished them back again. She could not see far. Through the east window, the mill where her son Jesse presided. Through the south window, a few yards of the road by which the others would return, no more, for the February mist shut her in. Early in the afternoon, she had made a tour of the house, as she did every day of her life. The inspection of the commodious domain gave her such a pleasant sense of mistressship. In the large upper rooms, now full of light reflected from snow, stood chest after chest of bedding, beloved by her. Homemade quilts, homespun sheets, home-woven coverlets of various colors, the work of ancestresses skillful as Penelope. So many movements of patient fingers, accompanied by thoughts that were sometimes fiery, had gone to their making that they were like paragraphs of family history materialized. Susanna could have found any one of them in the dark. The parlor also, papered with a pattern of irises, whose own bulbs would not have known them, and furnished on a scale of dignified recklessness, was exactly as she wanted it. But it was of the kitchen that she could say, "Here I am the happiest." When she came to die, she would think of leaving life as leaving the kitchen. The stove, which could accommodate a harvest time dinner, and the table capable of indefinite enlargement, gave invitations. On the windowsills, geraniums and begonias industriously bloomed. The grandfather's clock had come from her family. Before her eyes had lost their vague infant blueness, she had stared at the flowers inlaid on the mahogany case, and she had started for school by its advice, so that to her its stroke had a paternal sound. Among the contents of the dresser, the place of honor was held by a pewter beer mug marked JH 1735, which had accompanied the immigrant Johann Heilig on his journey from a Rhinish village to Philadelphia. When Susanna regarded the clock with a possessive air, her husband's eye reverted to the mug. This inscription had perhaps inspired the other, JH 1867, cut on the corner of the wood chest laboriously by Jesse on the occasion of his remaining alone at home on a Sunday morning. That inscribed corner was now a favorite seat of his. That caught me immediately because one of the earliest families in the section of Montgomery County I now live in were the Heiligs. So I thought, well, that's really intriguing. Did she know that name because she had done some research? But they were living in a place called Heiligtal, which was basically Heilig Valley. Once again, her husband, Job, was a difficult, obstinate man, standing in the way of his sons who wanted to do other things and a daughter who wanted to do other things. And this book was, as I said, very well received in 1910 when it was published. And here I have a little review. There were many reviews of it. It was published by Harper's, so she had a very good publishing company behind her. But from the Chicago Tribune, the reviewer says, if the author of Heart's Contending were a great artist, we should have in this novel a piece of work worthy of George Eliot. As it is, we have, at any rate, a worthy novel. It is a piece of life crammed with reality. There is a tragic possibility in the Heilig family as pictured here, the kind of tragedy Thomas Hardy described as beyond the gates of the world. So she was being put in some very good company of George Eliot, marvelous, and Thomas Hardy, marvelous. And these comparisons weren't just coming from this reviewer, they came from many reviewers who thought that she was writing in a very realistic fashion. However, in my reading it and knowing what I know, it just doesn't ring true to the Pennsylvania Germans. Not that Helen Martin's did, but the vocabulary, as I said, is a little problematic. But of course, she was writing in 1910, so I think we have to give her some leeway. Now, Helen R. Martin, though, reviewed her book in 1923, The House of Yost, which was about, actually, in this case, a mother who was stubborn and obstinate and did not want her son to marry a certain girl that he fell in love with. And the son was sort of a dreamer. George Yost in the book, and Helen R. Martin took great exception to that. These people are so far from being typical Pennsylvania Germans, Martin wrote, that they would really be strange exotics in Berks County, the scene of the story. For instance, so frugal a race are they that I doubt whether any Pennsylvania German that ever lived could be so overwhelmed by grief as to become recklessly improvident and wasteful and shoot a good riding horse from sentiment, throw away a gold ring, burn up good furniture. Well, I do agree with that. They'll wear it out before they burn it up. No young Pennsylvania German farmer that I have ever heard of writes verses. I don't agree with that. I think they did write verses. Composes music. I think they compose music. Goes on drunken sprees. Well, plays childish practical jokes. Oh, come on. What Dutchman doesn't play childish practical jokes? And spends money recklessly, all of which accomplishments and vices are attributed to George. So she was very hard on Catherine Luce. But I do believe she was also probably sour grapes about it too. So because she had received such good notices for her earlier book. But this one, by this time, Catherine Luce had a different publisher. The House of Yost was not published by Harper. It did not get the same kind of exposure that Hearts Contending did. So I'm not exactly sure what was up with that, but it seemed that really her big book was going to be Hearts Contending for sure. So now let us move on to Elsie Singmaster, who I think a great deal of. Are you familiar with her? She was from Macungie originally. Oh, Ben said yes, because he was working in Gettysburg, and she was very significant to novels wrote a lot of novels and stories about Gettysburg. She wrote under her maiden name of Singmaster, but her married name was Lures. She was a Pennsylvania German born in Schuylkill County, also to a Lutheran minister like Helen Martin, and she went to Radcliffe. Now, please remember where they all went to school. These are some pretty lofty places that these ladies went to school, which is probably a very defining characteristic, that they were extremely well educated. They came from well educated families, professional families, and they were encouraged to go to school in a time when not a ton of women were attending colleges. I am very proud to say that my grandmother and great aunts, all born in the 19th century, went to normal school. My grandmother to Kutztown, my great aunts to Westchester. And that sort of underscored the fact that all of my sisters and I, all the women in our family, would continue to go to school and get degrees. And my aunt, my aunt, who was librarian at Conrad Weiser for a very long time. So we were really following sort of this same path. So she wrote 31 books, numerous short stories, and many books for young readers. I Hear of a River is one of her books for young readers. Very beautifully written, I think. I think that she encapsulates the Pennsylvania Germans like none other. I think she was a brilliant writer, and I have a little passage to read of hers, but I'll just go on to the next slide. This is her book for young readers, Rifles for Washington, that was illustrated by the great illustrator Frank Schoonover, if you've heard of him. Very wonderful on the level of N.C. Wyeth and people of that ilk. But here is a passage from Elsie Singmaster's first book, Katie Gallmer, where she writes about Katie, who lived in Macungie, which was known as Millerstown at that time. Are you familiar with where Macungie is? It's in Lehigh County, close to Berks County, pretty close to Berks County. Okay, so Elsie writes, every Wednesday evening in winter, Katie Gallmer went to Millerstown Post Office for her grandfather's Weltbote, the German paper which circulated among the Pennsylvania Germans of Millerstown. By 6 o'clock, she and Grandfather Gallmer and Grandmother Gallmer had had supper. By 6:30, she had finished drying the dishes. By 7:30, she learned her lessons for the next day, and then a scarlet shawl wrapped about her, a scarlet nubia on her head, scarlet mittens on her hands, Katie set forth into Millerstown's safe darkness. Sometimes, Oh, the thrill that closed her throat and ran up and down her spine and set her heart to throbbing and her eyes to dancing at sound of that closed door. Sometimes it rained and she pushed her way out into the storm as a Viking might have pushed his boat from the shore into an unfriendly sea. Sometimes it snowed and she lifted her hot face so she might feel the light cold flakes against her cheeks. Sometimes deep drifts lay already on the ground and she flung herself upon them or into them. Sometimes she danced back to say a second goodbye so that she might enjoy her freedom once more. Sometimes she stole under the tall pine trees and knocked ponderously at the door, knowing perfectly well that her grandmother and grandfather would only smile at each other and not stir. Sometimes she crossed the yard in the snow to her knees to rap against the kitchen window of Bevy Schnepp, who kept house for great Uncle Galmer, the squire. Bevy's real name was Maria Snyder, but Katie had renamed her for one of the mythical characters of whom Millerstown held foolish discourse, and the village had adopted the title. Bevy was little and thin and a powerful worker. She was cross with almost everyone in the world, even with Katie, whom she adored and spoiled. There was a tradition in Millerstown that she was once about to be married, but that at the ceremony her spirit rebelled. When the preacher asked her whether she would obey, she cried out aloud, "By my soul, no!" And the match was thereupon broken off. Bevy adorned her speech with many proverbs, and she had an abiding faith in powwowing and also in spooks, hexahemeron cats, and similar mysterious creatures. She had named the squire's dog Whiskey so that he could not be bewitched. As she would as soon have thrown her cabbage plants away as have planted them in any other planetary sign than that of the Virgin. She belonged, strangely enough, to a newly established religious sect in Millerstown, that of the improved New Mennonites, who had no relation to the long-established worthy followers of Menno Simons in other parts of the Pennsylvania German section. It is difficult to understand how Bevy reconciled her belief in the orthodox, if sensational preaching of the Reverend Mr. Hill with her use of such superstitious rhymes as Dulix ix ux, thou comest not over Pontio, Pontio is over Pilato, to which she had recourse when trouble threatened. Oh, excuse me. I think her writing is wonderful. It's very vivid. To me, it shows the Pennsylvania Germans in a sympathetic light, but still talks very much about the traditions that were so much a part of their lives still in the early 20th century, but talks about them in a way that is not insulting to the folk belief and tradition and the way these people were. But I really can get a wonderful visual image of Bevy Schnepp and Katie and their interaction just from these short passages. So here I called her the outsider because she's not from here. But now we're going to talk a little bit about Mildred Jordan, who wrote under her maiden name of Jordan, but her married name was Bauscher. So here we have her. She was born in Chicago, graduated from Wellesley. There we go. And married this gentleman, J. Lee Bauscher. And here on the screen, we have a portrait of him by the one and only Norman Rockwell. So you can tell what kind of fellow he probably was of great importance here in Berks County. They had a wonderful home over in, I believe it's the Hessian camp, is that's what it's called, outside of Reading. And I've seen some views of the home. I think it was for sale not long ago, and it was a stunning home over there. So a very interesting couple, and as you can see from her photograph, she was quite sophisticated, signing her this copy of One Red Rose Forever, which of course was her most famous book. Has anybody read One Red Rose Forever? Yes, some. I always knew about this book growing up. I hate to say I didn't read it until fairly recently when I read parts of it for giving this program. But I always knew about it because, of course, it's the story of the church in Mannheim where the rent was one red rose forever. And this ceremony was still going on at the church in Mannheim until fairly recently. I hope it's still going on. It's a wonderful tradition where the congregation or the pastor hands over one red rose in payment of rent to, I guess a descendant of the Stiegel family. And of course, Stiegel, in being from Western Berks, he was certainly a well-known figure in my neck of the woods, certainly in Schaeferstown, of just a very well-known character. This was a very, very big book in 1941 and came, I think, at a good time when there was so much fear and terrible things going on in the world. This book was probably very refreshing. And it was serialized even in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which was very significant. And this illustration, this strange illustration, is from that serialization in the Inquirer. But he's okay. Although he reminds me a little bit of Jefferson, especially Jefferson from 1776. And though she is, she looks like a 1941 woman, doesn't she? With those shoes and that outfit. It's right out of 1941. But I will read a little bit of One Red Rose Forever. This is from chapter 1 from the serialization in the Inquirer. The Nancy lay exhausted in the Philadelphia harbor. For a month, she had been buffeted westward by a temperamental ocean, tossing her 50 passengers like so many ninepins. Now, on this last day of August, 1750, she emptied them onto the Market Street wharf and turned her mind to cows, out of which she had come. Heinrich Wilhelm Stiegel, being 21, had left Germany with flaring confidence. But I don't want you to go, Minnie had whispered to him that last spring day in the woods. Why must you go, Heinrich? Because in America I shall be both rich and famous. But the young men who wish to be famous musicians come to Germany to study. In America, there are only Indians, Heinrich. He laughed, oddly touched and irritated by the wilted wildflowers in her hand. He would always think of Minnie with the mingled warmth of spring and summer, with the earthy richness of molding leaves and early tender blooms. I want everything, Liebling, he said. And there is everything waiting for me in America. Great forests, great rivers, land that men have never even seen, men and women who have courage and who long for beautiful music. But someday you would be famous in Germany too, Minnie persisted stubbornly. So if you're familiar with Baron Stiegel, he was quite the character. Of course, famous glassworks. He was involved with the ironworks in Lebanon and I believe Lancaster, Western Berks County. So just a wonderful character to write a book about, and I guess something of a womanizer, so that made good fodder for this book. And it was probably what we would call today a bodice ripper of sorts. Then another big book for Mildred Jordan was this lovely thing. I have a copy that was given to me by a coworker because I do this program. But what I love most about these books, I think they're wonderful books, but what I love most is the wonderful covers of they're so beautiful. Actually, one of our board members said to me he bought the book simply because the cover was so wonderful. They're just gorgeous. And in some cases, they don't have the dust jacket, and this is actually printed on the cover of the book. So it's a wonderful collectible thing for sure. The Apple in the Attic is a really interesting tale about a horrible husband and a very put upon wife. And they go to market, and the wife in the book sells something for a lower price than he wants her to. And he decides he will never speak to her again. Mind you, they're still married. but he's never going to speak to her again. At the same time, she is having trouble conceiving, which of course it would be a terrible thing for a farming family of the early 20th century, which is when this takes place. No, and I should add that these characters were not Mennonite or Amish. They were just church Germans, which is different from a lot of the other tales. So she goes ahead and tries some powwow remedies, which he also doesn't agree with. So there were a lot of different elements in this story. It's a bit of a tragedy. I think it's funny on some levels, but also very tragic, and was made into a play, which was performed. I don't know if it made it to Broadway, but it was very popularly performed at Mount Gretna. If you've ever been to Mount Gretna Theater, back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, Mount Gretna was actively producing a lot of these Pennsylvania German-themed plays, whether it be Apple in the Attic, or there's one called Papa Is All that's crazy, and Plain and Fancy, my personal favorite. So this was one of those plays that was being produced by Mount Gretna and other regional theaters up until, the 1980s, probably, when nobody does these plays anymore, because unfortunately they're very outdated theme-wise. This was a book for young readers. I'm not sure if that's over on the table. This is a display from Mildred Jordan's granddaughter Abigail of some things related to her and a lot of her books. I'm not sure if this one's over here, but this one became very popular, and this is a newspaper photo of a young girl who used the recipe in the shoe fly pie book to make a shoe fly pie for herself and her doll. Okay, so now we'll go on to Anne Harp, who really was not a fiction writer, but I love her work. I find it fascinating, and I wanted to include her. So she was born in Lancaster County. Her father was a Moravian pastor, which led her to getting educated at the Moravian Seminary for Women. Her father was also a founding member of the Mount Gretna Chautauqua, which have you been to Mount Gretna? Here I'm talking about it, but if you haven't, do go to Mount Gretna. It's still marvelous. Yes, one of the audience members.
Yeah, there's Chautauqua grounds where the camp meets.
Yes.
And then there's the regular grounds where the rich people came.
Yes, exactly. The rich people from Dublin. Yes, my orthodontist cousin bought a property in Mount Gretna in that part. Yeah. I was very lucky to speak at Mount Gretna once many years ago. And I was invited for dinner in one of the houses that were part of the original Chautauqua settlement. And I thought, oh, this is heaven on earth. I just wish I could live here forever. But please do visit. It's a lovely place to visit. So she was a journalist and worked for Philadelphia newspapers and wrote for the Ladies' Home Journal. This is a lovely, it's for young readers, but it's appropriate for almost anybody not from 1943, the story of the Pennsylvania Dutch with drawings or lithographs by C.H. DeWitt. And then Anne Harp wrote the text for this. But these are, here is Ephrata, if you can see it. It's just a wonderful book. These drawings are wonderful. See, who else do we have here? Here we have Conestoga wagons, just really, really beautiful. Oh, I wish this original artwork was out there somewhere, but sadly, when so many of these things were sent to publishers, they just ultimately disappeared, which is a real shame. And she wrote 9 books, including this one, Hex Marks the Spot, which is a collection of stories Well, they're not. They're nonfiction stories. They're little essays about the Pennsylvania Germans, particularly about powwow in this case with Hex Marks the Spot, which was very, very popular and went through 5 printings. She also wrote an excellent cookbook with, I think it was with Preston Barba, the great Pennsylvania German scholar. I think he wrote it. So it's a really well done cookbook. If you ever see that, because it had that scholarly backup of Preston Barba, whoever was her co-writer on that book. And that I just bought a copy of that, a new copy, so it's been reprinted on Amazon not that long ago. So I highly recommend looking at that cookbook because it gives not only the recipes of our traditional Pennsylvania German dishes, but also some history of it too. I really like it. Hex Marks the Spot included paint illustrations by Eleanor Hart Levis, who was from Montgomery County. And although these are not pictures in the book, these are 2 unusual paintings from our collection that depict at the Schwenkfelder Heritage Center that depict Pennsylvania German life. In the one on the left, a group of what appear to be Mennonite ladies sitting on a bench. I think they're probably in some sort of a worship service. I've never been able to figure that one out. It's an unusual painting. And the other one I just think is marvelous. I assume it's of Central Market. It's not identified. But this was the only book that Eleanor Levis illustrated. So when I discovered that she did these illustrations and then we had these paintings, it gave me a little more insight into who she was. Okay, now we shall move on to what really brought me into this. Are you familiar with Catherine Milhouse? Some are nodding. She was a brilliant artist and author, just wonderful. You may recognize her last name as part of a name of someone else who was quite famous, and it's because they shared Quaker heritage, and you know who that is? Richard Nixon. Yes, Richard Milhouse Nixon. And they were probably distant cousins on some level. They weren't close, but I'm sure with that name they were related somehow. So she was born in Philadelphia to Quakers, had an excellent education in art through the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And most importantly, she was a supervisor for the WPA Art Project, which is where many of you will probably know her work from. And she, at the latter part of her life, she lived in Philadelphia with her partner, Frances Licton. Do you know her name? The great Frances Licton, who wrote early on Pennsylvania folk art. She worked for the Philadelphia Museum of Art and was an artist and wrote that wonderful book. I think it's called Pennsylvania German Folk Art. That may be the title, but it's an excellent early book on different aspects of folk art, redware, textiles, furniture that she wrote, I think, using the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection as the basis for it. So here we have these marvelous WPA posters that Catherine Milhouse designed for the WPA, as I assume for tourism marketing purposes, always emphasizing that quaintness, mostly the Amish, which by this time in the 1930s, automobile travel had taken off, and particularly automobile travel from, say, New York City or Philadelphia or other accessible places by automobile into Pennsylvania, and specifically centered on Lancaster County, to see all these quaint people and our barns with hex signs in Berks County and all of these wonderful things that they could experience here in Pennsylvania Dutch country. And Catherine Millhouse was partially responsible for driving people here, I think. I consider this part of how the Pennsylvania Dutch became more of interest to the general American public by the 1930s. It's part of a whole trend in interior decoration and food, everything by the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Here is, do you know this book? Oh, yes. And here's you can still get this book. This was recently given to me by one of my volunteers to use in these programs. And this is a little mini paperback copy of The Egg Tree. It originally was more this size. So now they've shrunk it down to this size, which is too bad. But so sweet and wonderful illustrations of making the egg tree a common Easter time Pennsylvania German tradition. She wrote these books for young readers, and this, of course, won the Caldecott Award. And here are some photos, charming, charming photos. She had that combination of traditional ideas and a more modern style that would have been taught to her at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, in which she obviously honed working on the WPA project. And then this one, when I was growing up, I had a copy of this book that I believe was passed down from my sisters, who are a tad older than me, but Apollonia's Valentine. Does anybody remember this wonderful thing? Oh, good, good. And this, once again, was also about this size of a book. And this was a modern tale of a little girl, but look at these illustrations and how she integrated, for instance, a Lone Star patchwork into the sun in the image of the schoolhouse. So the sun became the Lone Star patchwork. That was so brilliant. And Proctor motifs like the angel blowing on the church in the lower left-hand corner. What else? Oh, of course, the chest and the quilt and the frocktour on the wall in the center image of Apollonia making her Valentine. The Scherenschnitte that went into making the Valentine, and you could kind of use the book as a guide to make your own Scherenschnitte Valentine. But I'm sure that Catherine was influenced a lot by Francis Licton and accessibility to the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection and their what was at that time their great Proctor collection, their redware, their painted Pennsylvania German chess. They were at the forefront of collecting before many other institutions were collecting Pennsylvania German objects. I have a little, just my one last little reading for today. All of a sudden, Apple began to skip along the road. A painted Valentine, that would be fun to make, but it would have to be the most beautiful Valentine in the world, one that would really look like a token of love and friendship. If she only had a paint box all her own so she could practice at home. Then she had an idea. She waited till supper time to ask Pop and Mom if Dan could drive her to market in the morning. Whatever for, said Pop and Mom. To sell my eggs, said Apple. My pullets are laying. Sell your eggs, Apollonia. Whatever for, said Pop. To buy a paint box, answered Apple. For the land's sake, Apollonia, whatever for, asked Mom. When the whole story came out, how Apple was no good at making cutouts. I don't blame her, I'm not either. But with a paint box of her own, she was sure she could have made the most beautiful Valentine in the world. Dan thought so too. Let me drive her to market, please, Pop, said Dan. Pop smiled and nodded. Dan often drove the steady old horse. After supper, he, Pop, would ask his Amish friends to set up a table for Apple in their stall in the market. So the next morning, which was Saturday, Dan drove Apple to market. She spread a check tablecloth on the little table, placed her bowl of eggs upon it, and waited. She was the youngest market woman in the market. And there's a picture of her, of course, being set up with the Amish friends selling her eggs. And what she was trying to do actually was make a Valentine, I believe, for a refugee in Europe. So this was a post-war, this was taking place in the 1950s, where she was making this Valentine for somebody in Europe after the war. I think that's how the story goes, but I'd have to check it again. But once again, if you've never seen the book, please check it out. And here's one that we love in Montgomery County. Have you heard of Marguerite d'Angely? Yes, good. Oh, wonderful. Marguerite d'Angely is an eternal favorite of people in Montgomery County, people in Philadelphia, and actually people across the country. So if you haven't heard of her, I hope you will also look her up. She was born in Michigan, but the family moved to Philadelphia in 1902. She had no formal higher education, and she and her husband, John, had 6 children, one of which I'm very pleased I was able to know, her son, Maury, who restored Rolls Royces and built stringed instruments like harpsichords. Rather extraordinary family. And we at the Heritage Center had an exhibit of her work that had remained in the family, probably 15 years ago now. Very little of her material remained in her family or is even out there in public collections. I believe in Lapeer or another Michigan library, there is a collection of her things, but once again, a lot of her work got sent to the publisher and then disappeared. This is what, when I'm talking to Maury, we were pretty sure this is probably what happened. And she has won more awards than any of these other ladies. So here we have an illustration from Yanni Wondernose, or Wunderfitz, as we often say, from 1944, which is about a little Amish boy and his curiosity. Her books dealt with children of all ethnicities. One of my volunteers gave me the Polish themed book, which is a charming tale also, but dealing with the melting pot that is the United States and all the different ethnicities. And then we have The Great Skipack School, which was written about our Montgomery County Mennonite schoolmaster, Christopher Dock, who you may have heard of. There's a school named after him, but he was a very, very significant colonial figure, German colonial figure. He wrote the first German language pedagogy, as a matter of fact, probably the first pedagogy in the United States that was published by Christopher Sauer. So here we see the building of the Skipack School, where Christopher Dock taught, and of course a printing press that went hand in hand with that. Probably that character is Christopher Sauer, but a really great little tale of Christopher Dock's time at teaching at the Skipack School. He was a beloved schoolmaster, and I am happy to say at the Heritage Center, we actually own several Proctor that he made. So his reputation continued on. And then, of course, Henner's Lydia, which is about a young girl who, now I can't remember the story, and I apologize she wants to go to market and do something, and I can't remember what it was, but she's shown there working on her hook drug on the porch of her house, but she doesn't want to be kept down just staying at home. She's a curious young girl.